Hi there. Welcome to another session with Warwick and I. Today we're going to go through excellence in consumer engagement. We're going to pull out 10 fundamentals to share. Warwick's going to discuss with us some of his learnings from Australia in particular, and I'm going to add in some examples from the UK region in consumer engagement. And we're going to touch on things like price controls, and we're going to touch on the fact that consumer engagement is wider than just price controls and wider than utility sectors, and there's learnings here for multiple sectors as well. And so myself and Warwick are delighted that you've joined us, and we're going to first start off a little bit about ourselves. We're a small consultancy company called MCC Economics, and we focus on economic analysis to drive informed decisions. And our expertise is listed here on the slide. We focus a lot on regulatory economics and things like financial modeling, financial strategy, economic analysis, and consultation analysis as well. And so I'll hand over to Warwick to take us through from slide 3 onwards. Thanks, Warwick.
Yeah, terrific. Good to be with you, everyone. So let me tell you a story. 10 years ago, I was at a conference and I was participating in a panel session. And in the audience was full of regulatory managers. And someone asked the question, what do you see as the next most important trend in economic regulation? And my answer was consumer engagement. And at that point, I lost the entire audience. They were looking at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. And understandable, because at that time, consumers were nowhere in the regulatory process. We had a saying that a regulatory determination is something that gets done to a consumer. They pay the outcome of the regulatory determination, but they had no influence in the process at all. And that was really sad. But look, 10 years on, what we are seeing in Australia has exceeded even my most optimistic scenario. We're seeing a real maturity in consumer engagement, and consumers are now in the position where they're able to influence and own the outcomes. So look, what we'd like to do tonight is kind of take you on that journey with us, how we went from nowhere to a relatively mature consumer engagement framework, and take you through some of the fundamentals in that process. So look, first of all, why consumer engagement? Why does it matter? Why is it important? And look, my answer to that is twofold. First of all, it can really add to company value. It also is a strong antidote to serious afflictions. But done badly or not done at all, it can be destructive. And I'll take you through some examples a little later to show you what happens when it's done well and what happens when it's done badly. So at the moment in Australia, social license has become a real buzzword. 20 years ago, there was almost no mention of social license. But now it's everywhere. So what is social license? We'll list it on the slide there, a couple of organisations who I think have done a good job at defining social license. But essentially what it is, if you have a legal right to do something, that's no longer sufficient. You also need the goodwill and trust of the community to operate. And again, when we get to examples, I'll illustrate how that works. So I have here 3 examples of when consumer engagement and social license go badly. The first of those is the Royal Commission into the Australian banking sector, which started in 2017. And at the time, most people were like, well, yeah, we know that the banks aren't the best corporate citizens, but a Royal Commission is probably a little over the top. What emerged from that Royal Commission staggered everybody. Perhaps the most egregious example of conduct is one of the banks was charging fees to their customers even after the customers had died. And the outcome from the Royal Commission was extraordinary. Of the major 4 banks, 3 of the CEOs lost their jobs, boards were dismissed, companies ceased to operate, billions of dollars in compensation going back to consumers. And so it kind of illustrates that, look, even though you're in a position of power, you may have a legal right to operate in a certain way. Without the goodwill of the community, you can come undone. Second example there, the Australian Energy Regulation Framework. We used to have a merits review framework, and that was really unfortunate in terms of consumer engagement, because what it meant is that the businesses who were regulated had their focus on that merit review body. And so rather than trying to bring customers along on the journey, what they did is they put in submissions which were highly legalistic. Consumers weren't able to engage in the process. And they were relatively successful in that process in attracting additional revenues out of the review process. But consumers were really unhappy. They weren't able to participate. The prices they were being charged were going up because of the review process, and they were able to persuade the government to remove the merits review process. The third example there is lock the gate. And this is something that emerged with mining companies in Australia. And again, mining companies had a legal right to access properties, but they did so badly. They didn't have the courtesy to go and speak to the landholders. They would drive onto the property, they'd leave gates open. Sometimes they'd bring bolt cutters and cut the chains that were locking the gates. And there was a really extensive community reaction to that sort of conduct. And on the right there, you can see that there was a movement called Lock the Gate, where they really pressed hard on the governments that, look, the approvals that you're giving just aren't sufficient, and we need additional protections. Now, when it goes well, it's actually quite hard to find examples of when consumer engagement goes well, because when it does go well, it's quiet. There's no media attention. Here's one example that we had. Powerlink, which is the owner of the electricity transmission system in Queensland, decided that they would try and put a proposal to the regulator that was capable of acceptance by themselves, the regulator, and their consumers. And they went to a lot of effort to build their consumer engagement and have that influence the proposal that they put to the regulator. And what we saw as a result of that was that the regulator was ultimately able to accept the proposal that had been put to us. So one of the really important fundamentals is that consumer engagement has to be driven from the top of the organisation. And we have seen a couple of examples that happened at the same time where the sorts of activities that were undertaken were very similar, and yet one of those processes was an outstanding success and the other was a destructive failure. And so what was the driver there? It was the attitude from the top of the organisation. In the successful case, the board and the CEO were deeply engaged in the process, and they gave authority to their teams to reach out to consumers and to understand what they were looking for. In the second case, the CEO put together a consumer engagement team and told them, go away and do something on consumer engagement. And there was no linkage back to the regulatory proposal. If you only take one lesson from this presentation today, I would say that attitude is everything. And so what we saw in that previous example was the difference between success and failure. So in that first example, the business was genuinely seeking the views of consumers and to have those views influence the proposal it put to the regulator. In the second example, where there was a failure, the approach was, look, we have in mind already what we want to achieve in our regulatory proposal. Go away and find some support for that. And in that second example, consumers very quickly understood that it wasn't a genuine process and that their views weren't influencing the process. And we saw that they dropped out. And so what we've got here is 4 points which I think are fundamental in terms of attitude. There needs to be a commitment from the top of the organisation, an openness to new ideas. And what we hear from the businesses that do this well is they say that, look, while we went into this for the purpose of building a regulatory proposal, we have come out the other side as a better business. We understand our consumers better. We know what they want. We're better able to serve their needs. Ongoing consumer engagement is really important, not just building something for the regulatory proposal, but to have something that then operates across the breadth of the business. And finally, ensuring that consumers have confidence in the process and that they are being heard and that the things that they say are having an impact, both on the operation of the business and on the regulatory proposal. Now, let's say, okay, that's all terrific. Where do we find the consumers to engage with? And the answer is, you don't. There's not a cohort of consumers out there who are ready and equipped to participate in these processes. You need to grow your consumers. Now, in Australia, we were very fortunate. There was a budget round where the regulator was given money to establish a consumer challenge panel. And really, that was a set of seed funding that allowed a whole range of things to happen. Firstly, to recruit consumers, to spend time with them, to train them, to help them understand the regulatory framework, to help them understand the businesses that were being regulated. And really, from that seed, we then saw an expansion, and the businesses were able to utilize some of those people who had come through the Consumer Challenge Panel, and it really established an example of how to go about this. Look, no mistake, this is hard, and you will find that engaging with consumers is confronting and challenging. Consumers will come with their own perspectives that are different to what you might have in mind. And it takes time and resources. But hopefully what you've seen from the examples so far is that it's incredibly worthwhile and valuable in the process. And look, ultimately, what you're looking to do here is to have consumers as partners inside the business. Again, the best consumer engagement that we see is from a group that is continuing throughout the operation of the business, and not something that's just put together for a regulatory proposal. And those consumers are able to have an ongoing influence and able to help the business when it comes up against tricky problems. Now, speaking here to regulators, what can be done to set the right incentives? You want consumer engagement to be something that is self-starting, not something that's imposed unwillingly on businesses. And so what are the levers that are available? And in my view, there's a few things that can be done. First of all, reputation. And so regulators can call out good behaviour and also call out bad behaviour. And for some businesses, that matters. For other businesses, they don't care, and reputation alone is not enough. It might be the case that regulators are able to provide an easier process where they observe that there is good consumer engagement, and that has influenced the proposal that's in front of them. Some regulators we have seen have introduced financial rewards. In particular, the Victorian regulator here in Australia has a program where they allow an uplift to the rate of return where consumer engagement is done very well. And look, that final point there, merits review is an absolute killer for incentives. Yep, sorry about that. I dropped out for a minute. Am I back?
You're back, Warwick. Yep. You were just talking about the merits review being a killer.
Yeah, merits review is a killer for the incentive to undertake consumer engagement. So look, my final point here is I haven't spoken at all about the sorts of activities that you undertake for consumer engagement. And I've listed this point last because in some respects it's the least important. All of those other points that we've covered are much more important for establishing a good consumer engagement framework. Having said that, though, the activities that you undertake are not unimportant. There's no single way to get good input from consumers, and in some circumstances, some will work better than others. And so in the early days, what we saw is that businesses would come to us and they would say, okay, can you give us a checklist of all the things that we need to do in order to do consumer engagement? And what you can see from that approach is that, look, the attitude wasn't right from the start. Consumer engagement is not a checklist that you undertake. And so for the businesses that do this well, they do a lot of engagement face-to-face. They establish websites. They do surveys. They have email correspondence with people. And there's a whole range of different activities. One thing I would say, though, is that the sorts of activities that you undertake for consumer engagement are time-consuming and take quite a lot of company resources. If you haven't started consumer engagement 18 months before you lodge your proposal, you're in big trouble. So, PJ, that's the Australian experience.
Very good. Excellent work. Thank you very much for that. So, having had a deep dive there with Warwick into the Australian experience, we put together a few slides here from the UK perspective, in particular from the water sector and the energy sector, as regulated by Ofwat and Ofgem. And a lot of what Warwick has just covered from the Australian perspective also applies over to the UK perspective as well. Warwick mentioned the Consumer Challenge Panel in Australia, and in the UK there's been groups with different names. The Consumer Engagement Panel or Consumer Engagement Group, for example, were set up with very similar remits in the UK for the different industries, and there's been different models applied. In UK, there's been industry central consumer groups with appointed experts. There's been groups set up for each company with their own experts respectively, and sometimes there could be 10 or more companies that are working towards a regulatory settlement or a regulatory decision. So that's been a lot of people have been involved in this space. And so we've got some really good do's and don'ts coming out of that, that we've listed a few here on the screen from the Ofwat and water sector perspective for the last two price controls that have been going through. PR24 is coming to finalisation this year, but PR19 also, we've got some really good learnings there as well. But I think some of the things that Warwick touched upon are things like the social license, which I think is just a great phrase because it helps you understand that it's not just a legal issue that you should think about when you're running your businesses or your organizations. It's the social buy-in and the social license that you really want to master and achieve and get to that higher bar. So even though something's legal, like the banks charging their customers even though they've died, because there's some cost to run on a bank account, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, and it's a very, very quick way to lose your legitimacy with your customer and run into some difficulties quite quickly. So we know in this day and age that it's very easy to lose that social license and that legitimacy. And so a lot of this consumer engagement is about keeping that, reducing the risks around that, and improving value coming out of that. And so not just Ofwat but also Ofgem have put a lot of work into this area, trying to improve the engagement from consumers for the energy company business plans, and trying to make sure that they're front and center. And you can see one of the acronyms there, the Consumer Challenge Group, as they're known in the Rio context. And some of their work is published as well online, where you can see what they think of each company's business plan and so forth. And you can see how they challenge the companies as they develop their business plans over a period of maybe 2 or 3 years before the price control was settled. So there's a lot of precedent out there about what has been done, and there's a lot of ability now to compare not just Australia with the UK, but also the water sector with the energy sector, and to compare the different price controls over time as well, because this has been going on as well for most of the last 10 years in the UK in one way or another. And so there's loads of ability to compare where companies have done really well and where they haven't done so well. And a lot of that comes down to the buy-in to the program and the work that's put into this area to try and get consumers engaged. And that means different things for different sectors, because you have a different type of consumer, different makeup and different interests for consumers there. And so it really has to be specific there and well thought through. So yeah, that brings us to the end of our presentation today. We'd be delighted to pick up the conversation on consumer engagement. We've got more information available, and in addition to everything that we discussed today. So feel free to get in touch with myself or Warwick if you'd like more information in this area. And hopefully you enjoyed this session, and keep an eye out for future ones coming up, hopefully shortly. But that's all from me, Warwick, unless you have anything else to add.
No, that's good. It's been terrific.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
All right.
See ya.